Talofa class, this is Educ 101, and this is Dr. Cherie Chu-Fuluifaga with a guest lecture on Pacific education here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So our lecture is titled Tangata o Te Moana Nui, Understanding Education and Society for Pacific People in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So Tangata o Te Moana Nui refers to people of the ocean, of the Pacific Ocean. So if we think about the Pacific, we think about images, we think about people, we think about histories, we think about stories, narratives. But unfortunately for some people, the notion of the term Pacific, or the concept of the Pacific, whether it's an island or a place or a story, is about the romanticization of the swaying palm trees, the blue lagoons, the bure or the fale that sits above the ocean, a place to go for a holiday, around tourism, around experience, around resorts, around drinking cocktails, eating local food, but never more than that. And so if we think deeply about the Pacific, what is it? Who are we as Pacific people? What are our challenges, our issues in Aotearoa, New Zealand? What are our histories? Why are we here in this country when we have our places in the region, our countries in the region? So this lecture will be critical. It will unpack some of these ideas and allow for a more critical discourse and analysis to take place. So if we were in class, I'm sure we would have a very colourful and heated and enjoyable discussion. But if we think about taking it to our own learning, thinking about where we are right now, whether we are at home or in a flat or in the library or somewhere warm, what do you know about the Pacific and or about Pacific peoples? What do you know? What type of knowledge do you have about Pacific peoples? Is it from the media? Is it from your engagement, your relationships with Pacific friends, peers, communities in the regions that you've lived in? Perhaps it is that you have travelled to the Pacific region, that you have volunteered or have had a holiday. And so we always start with what we know about the Pacific or about Pacific peoples. Is it something we've read? Is it through lectures, through education? How have we learnt about Pacific peoples? And I'll introduce you to this word that probably many of you would know, which is this word diaspora. And when we connect it to Pacific peoples, we can say that in terms of diaspora, to disperse, for example, we are found in every part of the world. Many of us as Pacific peoples, pre-COVID at least, we're living in different countries, in countries such as Australia, the United States of America, New Zealand, Europe, Africa, Canada, vastly, of course, across the Pacific region. And this is an important element of our story as Pacific peoples, because we are a society, are peoples of navigators. We are journeying, we are moving for employment reasons, we are moving so that we can get better education in some of the westernized countries. These are economic reasons, in terms of remittances that are being sent back from our places of employment, our countries of employment back home. Remittances are one of the biggest forms of income or of economy in the Pacific. And so we are a dispersion of a people from our original homeland. This is why we are here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We were brought as the labourers, as the factory workers in the 50s and the 60s to fill the factories in the industrial areas, such as car factories, and putting things together, sort of industrial main assembly line types of work. And so we have had a history in this country, at least, of coming to work for employment, for a better life, for that biblical line of coming to a place, to a land of milk and honey, where we would seek an abundance of better opportunities than what it was in our homelands, where we are somewhat restricted in terms of earning a higher income, a higher wage. So if we keep asking ourselves what we know about Pacific, or who are Pacific peoples, we can say confidently at least there are 7 major Pacific ethnic groups that are identified by the New Zealand government. So Samoan, Cook Island Māori, Tongan, Niuean, Fijian, Tokelauan, Tuvaluan. And if we take the 3 groups of Cook Island Māori, it's my very poor outline there, Niuean and Tokelauan, for example, we have more of our Cook Islanders, our Niueans and Tokelauans living in New Zealand than we have back in the islands. And again, if we take the economic reasons, the shifts from the home island countries to Aotearoa New Zealand for employment, for education, then we can make connections as to why people move, as to why we have higher numbers of our Pacific populations here than back at home. And of course, if we take some other key ideas such as Samoan peoples being one of the highest or the biggest population in this country, that has quite a big influence, for example, around educational development, policy, language, and knowledge and power. If we take the other Pacific, which is, for me, for example, French Polynesian, Tahitian, so we're French speaking, we've been colonized by France. And so we don't speak English in Tahiti. It's a very different type of atmosphere. It's a different type of regime and colonization. So we are the French speaking Pacific, alongside New Caledonia and aspects of Vanuatu. Melanesian, what we refer to as black skin, our cousins, our colleagues who are Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islander, Fijian, and Vanuatu. Okay, Micronesian is also part of the Pacific and have been colonized by the Americans, and so we include island countries such as Federated States of Micronesia, Guam, Marshall Islands, Palau, and so forth. And so again, they have a different story to the Pacific, but they are still part of the Pacific, as in the Northern Pacific. And to get through to Micronesia, you'd often have to take the plane to Fiji, maybe to Kiribati, which is part of Micronesia, or from here, from Auckland, from Wellington to Auckland to Hawaii, and then a smaller plane to the islands up the top. We are diverse, multiple languages, identities, religions, SES, which is our socioeconomic status, our customs, traditions, beliefs, our generational challenges, differences between older generation, younger generation, grandparents, great-grandparents, and the youth. We have multiple identities. We're complex in our explanations and descriptions, and this should also be accounted for in our education systems. So, of course, the census have had its issues in terms of recording in the last census from being online, and one of the big things we know around Pacific peoples is that we don't go online. We prefer to be the face-to-face. We prefer to do handwriting, writing things together as families, and so some of the census data is not currently up to speed, but if we take it back to 2006, we are a growing population, as in the we of the 7 Pacific ethnic groups, including Melanesians and Micronesians and French Polynesians who are also part of the demographics now. So we make up at least 8 to 9% of the total population, and even if we go back to the statistic around Samoans being around at least half of the Pacific population, that Samoan is the third most widely spoken language in this country. And so we know that Pākehā, Palangi, European make up a majority of our population in this country, Māori then, and Asian, and Pacific. So according to the census in 2013, we're around, we could probably say 300,000 in Aotearoa. We're increasingly youthful, and if we look at classrooms, we will be at least 1 in every 4 students in the next 5 to 10 years, if not already. We are of multiple identities in terms of our ethnic identities. Many of us are what we would call awhakasi, so half caste, for example being Niuean and Māori, or even more multiple ethnicities. And so that has particular challenges for around what languages are spoken, what languages are taught in schools, how do we accommodate and look after and nurture our Pacific identities in schools and education. So as I said, Samoans are the largest ethnic group in New Zealand, followed by Cook Islands Māori, then Tongan and Niuean. And then if we look more deeply into terms of the statistics, we will find that probably 80% of Niuean population live in Auckland, and then the rest are dispersed through Aotearoa, but of course we have a big Niuean population here in Wellington. And Cook Islands Māori, they're not just located in South Auckland, but also in areas such as Tokoroa or Rotorua. So if we thought about the first places of migration, it would only take one family for to migrate to a specific region or a location in New Zealand for a job, and then many more family members would migrate and follow. And that is how migration occurs. And if we look at Tokoroa, it is the industry of forestry. It is the industry of woodwork. And so we have specific skill sets now from the 30, 40 years that we have been in this country, and in relation to employment. Fijian, 14.5, so maybe around 15,000 Fijians living here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And Tokelauan, this is a number that alludes the census to some extent, but I could say it's around 8,000, 9,000 Tokelauans, and not many Tokelauans living back in the 3 atolls or 4 atolls back in the Pacific. And one of the most remote places is Tokelau, and so to get to Tokelau, you have to take a boat from Samoa, which takes at least 3 days across the ocean. I love to record photos and memories of the many events that we have as Pacific peoples in this country, and while we live in a heavily westernized country, we still will bring our customs and our traditions to events such as birthdays, as weddings. This was a friend of mine, Catherine, who was marrying her husband, gosh, at least 10 years ago here in Wellington. She came from Niue, and where she lives, and her husband and her own a bakery, but her mother and father and her siblings live here in Wellington, and so they saw it fit to have their wedding and here in Wellington. But just this is of course their dance together, but following the dance they sit on 2 chairs, and family members bring up money in lava material, and sing and dance and accord the newly married couple with their blessings. And this is what I love about identities and cultures, and it's always about a flowing time. It's about changing circumstances, that it is energized, it is revitalized by the young people particularly, and sometimes challenging for the older generation. If we look at population growth, this is just a slide to indicate the nature of growth around 30, 40 years. And it's important. It's an important consideration, particularly if we're going to be policy makers, community peoples, educators, and even post-COVID, what this might mean in terms of growth, that as our borders may open up to Australia and the Pacific, that could be our unique bubble. It may change economics, it may change employment, it may change the population growth, but it is an important matter to consider. We may have more Pacific friends, cousins coming from the Pacific to be schooled here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, because of resources, because of scholarships, instead of going to America, or to for my Tahitian cousins going to France. So an important idea or concept is, of course, habitation, where we live. And this is really important for me as an educator, that I know where my Pacific communities, my peoples are, where we live. So we can see the numbers here, of course, identify us being a Manukau city in South Auckland. And in Auckland generally, we have the biggest Polynesian city in the world, Waitakere City, which is West Auckland, and of course here in Wellington, Porirua City. This means a lot in terms of me as an educator. If I'm thinking about planning programs, about distribution of resources, about where teachers, new teachers could be going in terms of schooling, and what are the needs and contexts for our Pacific peoples in these areas. In terms of Manukau City, which is the South Auckland area, that's a critical point, because if we look at where the airport is in Mangere, that is the entry point to the country, one of the entry points aside from Wellington International Airport and Christchurch. But essentially Auckland becomes a major transitional place and space for Pacific peoples who are migrating from the Pacific. And this is why we have one of the biggest populations in South Auckland, is the critical mass, the entry point to the country. The resources are there, the schools are located in the region, and this is a growing area as well. So Auckland is a particular area that we focus on, the Wellington region, and of course the Waikato region. In the South Island, we are less likely to live there, and that's not just because of the climate. Yes, that's one issue, because of the chilly area, but it's also because of employment. Our employment reasons haven't been highly considerably connected to our lives in the past. They are more so now with the sort of things like meatworks in Invercargill and Southland, and in Christchurch and Canterbury, different areas of work with building and construction. But this is in the past, it's been more around the North Island. And some ideas around the median age. So you can see half are younger, half are older than this median age of around 34 years. And again, very important point to take into account, because if we have a younger generation of Pacific peoples here in this country, what does it mean in terms of our educational achievement, our outcomes, our challenges, our needs, our contexts? And so we're more likely to be born in this country as we increase with the years, and then half of the population being born overseas. So there's often an interesting stereotype I sometimes get angry about, and that is that when people talk about Pacific peoples, they refer to them as the ones that come from the islands, but actually we are 3-4 generations deep into being New Zealand people, New Zealanders in this country. The third bullet point, of course, is a very good indicator of having a formal qualification, whether that is a bursary, school certificate, sixth form, NCEA, or a tertiary qualification, whether that is Polytechnic, Wānanga, Pacific private training institution, and universities. The last bullet point, the median income, has major consequences though for the way we live, how we cope with issues in health systems, access to health, our living conditions, our ability to buy houses, to own places and assets without being indebted to a creditor or a debtor. I don't know what the term is actually. And so we have a lot of challenges around increasing the median income or the average income. And this is why for some of us, we are looking at the issues or the challenges of completion, retention, participation in tertiary education, which is post-secondary school. Another formal institution that is, of course, important to a lot of Pacific peoples and communities is the church, whether that is the traditional church, so we could take Ifakasa, for example, or an Assembly of God, or a Catholic church, or a Wesleyan Methodist church. The church is a critical focus point for connection. It is a point of education for many of the younger people who learn their mother tongue in the traditional church, because sermons are only given in traditional mother tongue of Samoan, of Tongan, of Fijian, and so forth. And this important element of White Sunday that some of us in Educ 101 have been part of, and still are part of, and which requires young children to be demonstrating their ability to speak openly in their speeches and perform in front of a parish in their mother tongue. And it's a massive celebration as well. And so often I've spoken with church ministers who are a bit stressed because they're facing an exodus of young people from their traditional church service into the more modernized church places such as Arise, Destiny, Elam, and so forth, which are all performed in English and have elements of praise and worship that are connected to music and fun and singing. And so again, we have these two areas of tension where we have the older generation, the younger generation. How do we create or negotiate a more middle ground for our young people so that they are still confident in their identities and learning their languages and skills of knowledge, as well as encouraging a more dynamic way of culture existing. Some key issues that I cover in my stage 2 course, Pacific Nations Education, Educ 224, is that some of the research will, of course, focus on the negativities, that we are more likely to live in poverty, that we will be living in damp, cold houses, state houses, that we have existed in state houses for more than a generation at least. We are less likely to own our own homes and cars, which is of course connected to our places of employment, but it's also connected to our cultural obligations, our remittances that we have to pay, our whailawe to keep the relationship harmonious around our families, our extended families, to gift to give, to serve. And so the unpacking of these issues is complex and something that will take more than one lecture. It takes more than one course usually, and it takes multiple viewpoints, because we cannot just locate one answer, one response in one slide. Our linkages to financial debt, our loans, budgeting services among it, struggle to support Pacific families because of some of our burdened high interest loans. People are feeling obligated to take out loans to pay for tangi, for funeral, for celebrations. And again, very complicated topics. We are generally overrepresented in negative health statistics, and I have a particular viewpoint on this, whether that is that, of course, that people might say that the research says, or that's because, you know, Pacific families live in overcrowding, etc. But also I look at what we are suffering in terms of our health, our obesity, the foods that we eat. I call it the colonization of food groups that we seek out, such as McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Chinese takeaways. We have been taken to a new place in the world, whether it is Aotearoa, whether it is the United States, whether it is Australia, where it is the food is fabricated, is made, and our original primary food sources, of course, were that we lived off the land, that we planted the taro, the yams, the cassava, the plantation crops. We hunted for our pork, our chickens roam freely. We fished in previous times, and still continue to fish in some places, but I'm seeing less of that actually in the Pacific, and so we are more dependent on the colonized system, that it is easier actually to just perhaps buy the meat from the butcher, to buy the potato chips, to buy the cheese for your crackers. And so we need to think about what was it that we originally started with as peoples, as our strengths, as our core strengths, and how do we appreciate that and strengthen that knowledge instead of relying on what we don't have. So, wow, if we think about the word Pacific again, the term Pacific, as it relates to a group of people, to an identifier of people, we can say that it's an umbrella term. It's a broad term, and it has been used by the government as early as the 60s, or even in the 50s as well, to describe us as migrants, as peoples that came from our island countries to New Zealand. And what this term highlights is the lack of, or the disregard actually, for the diversity of each Pacific island or region or place that we have come from. And so it creates a myth that we are unified, that terms such as Polynesian, Pacific Islander, Pacific nations, is that it infers that in a way we are unified and that we are one. So we have to say quite clearly that we are diverse, and that we bring our own richness in terms of our histories and narratives and current contexts. And so if you are to be the teacher, you are to be the leader or the educator in the future, that you must always appreciate the context that we come from, because it is evolving, it is changing, it is complicated, and it is not a one line, it is a line of many trajectories, and this is very important to consider when we're thinking about Pacific peoples and education. So you might ask, if you're writing an essay, and if you're asking in my course, what term do I use? What term do I talk about in terms of our conversations? Because it's important to converse. It is important to discuss our complicated pathways, whether we are using the terms Pacifica, Pacifici, Pacific, Pacific Island, Pacific Islander, Pacific Nations, Polynesian. There is no one unified answer to this. We are not all on the one page when we come to discussing this term Pacific. I prefer to use the term Pacific because it embraces Micronesian, Melanesian, Polynesian and French Polynesian, and it is about the region in terms of Pacific. And then I change into connections with the term Pacifica, depending on the audience I'm speaking to or talking with in this country. But essentially what I tell my students is that as long as you have your own rationale as to the term that you're using, keep with it. You know, have your own argument, have your own rationale, have it embedded in the needs and context of Pacific peoples, rather than just using a term for the sake of using a term. Who is a Pacific person? Is it me? Is it for Pepe? Is it Kapini? Is it your friends in your class? Is it somebody you don't know, somebody you want to know? Have you ever had a Pacific person come to your house for dinner, for lunch? You know, we are more than a label. We are more than a category. We have our circumstances. We have our, as I have always said, our narratives. But it's a term that's been used definitely by university researchers, policymakers, schools, universities, colonizers, anthropologists, and in a sense it's led to generalization, and the stereotyping of Pacific people. Stereotyping is usually negative. Stereotyping is about fear. Stereotyping is about the saying of, well, I have brown skin, we have afro curly hair, we live in poor, damp, overcrowded houses, and it's a generalization that's applied. But we have to dig deeper. We have to know more about who we are as Pacific peoples. Students, staff of universities, learners, people of communities have to know more, and they have to be educated. And this is a side digression. A lot of you guys will know I live in Waikanai on the Kapiti coast, which is predominantly Pākehā Western in terms of demographics. And Celia, my daughter, and I were sitting in the Mahara place, which it has like a slide and a little roundabout. And I was sitting in the sun waiting for her. And there were three elderly people who were speaking about the National Party, with the change of leadership with Todd Mala. And I just wanted to overhear. Actually, I was just being nosy. And one of the older gentlemen had said, and I heard it very clearly, he said, does the National Party, do they want competency or do they want coloured people? And you know, for me, that was that moment. I was just like, right, time to do something. Time to look at this man with dagger eyes, and whether I say anything, again, that's a different story. But this is that generalization, that the negative stereotyping, the negative discourses that take place in our society. We can see the race riots that have come about in the United States. Again, a very complicated matter, but it is deep, it is hurtful, it is outrageous that people in this world have been minimized because of their skin color, because of their ways of being, and that people have been dominated. We cannot have this anymore. So we must recognize our histories, cultures, and languages, and more than that, we embed them into our learning, into our socialization, into our discourse, everyday conversations, into our school curriculums, into our ECE centres, and to our universities, polytechnics, and so forth. I'll just read this quote here. Groups defined on the basis of their ethnic affiliation in the New Zealand census of population and dwellings have quite diverse and complex origins in terms of their ancestry or descent. So these groups are not static. They are constantly changing through processes such as intermarriage, international migration, and what might loosely be termed the politics of ethnic self-identification, especially for people of mixed ethnic origin. Now, this quote can apply to many of us in this country. But there are key things that we need to take into account here for Pacific, and these are that we are diverse. We have complexities in our ancestries and descent. We are not static. And that processes such as marriage, as migration, as even ethnic self-identification impact on how we define ourselves and how we see ourselves in terms of our mixed ethnic origin. For many of us who have multiple ethnic identities. And so we must always keep this at the forefront of our minds and as we will become the teachers, as the educators, as the policy makers of this country, that fluidity, that culture is evolving, people evolve, and that people's own subjective identification is critically important to how they see themselves in this world, and that we appreciate that as well. So that came from Bedford and Dittam, and if you go on to do stage 2, we look at this a lot more, but really important to look at Richard Bedford's work, who focuses on the sociologies of peoples in this country. If we think about our traditional knowledge systems as Pacific peoples, and I think I covered some of this in our first lecture, that we have been influenced by, of course, traditional and non-traditional knowledge. And prior to colonization, religious contact, education for us as Pacific was about our belief systems. You know, as Pacific peoples, many of us have, our ancestors navigated the Pacific and under the moon, under the stars, with the tides and the waves, with no maps, with no GPS system. And we navigated, we traveled from Samoa to New Zealand, or from Tahiti to Aotearoa to Hawaii. And we pass on this knowledge system through our DNA, our genealogies, but also through our oratory, our systems of discussions, our talanoa, our ways of appreciating our identities is through our storying, our storytelling. And we have had groups that have guided us, which they, in some of our island countries, are our chiefly groups that believe and value and manifest these belief systems and values to protect our status as Pacific peoples. And Pacific peoples were educated through our tribal histories, our genealogy systems. And of course, this is highly valued across Pacific societies. And that this art of oratory is highly developed and of a political nature to ensure that our knowledge and power was maintained in different levels of our Pacific societies, and the skill of the elders, the chiefs. And so our learning was through observation, listening, memorizing, and practical application. And we acquired this knowledge like a mentoring relationship, or through an elder teaching this to the junior. And we learnt through observation, we learnt through practice, rather than learning through a textbook. And I just want to credit my dear friend Kumu Lanakila Kasupang. Kumu in Hawaiian Maori language refers to teacher. And this was his school, his class that travelled to Aotearoa in New Zealand many years ago. And we had an exchange with them, we as in some of my class. And here they are at Te Papa, performing a traditional performance. They hand make all of their costumes. They're taught to respect Hawaiian Māori culture, language, and Indigenous knowledge systems as a high school. So if we think about the past for us as Pacific, The notion of myths, legends, song, dance, poetry, proverbs, and rituals have been our sources of learning, our sources of knowledge. And this is where we learn about our behaviors, our attitudes, our value systems, our traditions. We learned about the past. We learned about who we were and we are. And if we think about who brought the knowledge along, other knowledge, we think about the missionaries in the 1700s who came to the Pacific with the primary objective to convert the indigenous people of the Pacific to Christianity. And so this is where the written word, the English written word, was introduced in the Bible. And that elders, chiefs who had power said, well, it is time to learn the English word. And then the process of Christianity and colonization, in the sense that the missionary work, there became the increasingly valued notion of English language and values. And this is where people learnt to read and write in terms of contact with the missionaries, who were seen to have superior knowledge. Who were the missionaries? They were white. They were from Europe. They set themselves up very well, located in the Pacific Islands and the communities, and they built churches. They built places of worship that were 4 walls, a roof, something that was, again, a foreign structure, a colonized structure. If we go to the Pacific traditional architecture spaces, we don't have 4 walls. We don't even have a square. We live and we work and breathe in spaces that are communal and collective, and that allow the breeze to come in at night rather than to be contained. So the written word and the ability to read became the symbols of progress and status. Really important point there. The written word and the ability to read became the symbols of progress and status, and in some ways has remained as our primary goal. In terms of the implications for education in Aotearoa New Zealand, if we think about some of the challenges that I've presented to you in this lecture, of the past, of the present, of the way we are living, of our being, we are seen as, there is some major issues to contend with, whether it is racism, whether it is institutional racism, whether it is that we are a part of a more youthful population in this country, where more Pacific children will be in classrooms, that we are a slow growing, aging population, and we will be part of the social change. We are driving the social change. We are creating more educational outcomes through research, through paradigm shifts. We are trying to convert, in some ways, the old world into the new world of, this is the new Pacific, this is the new vision, this is the new youth that are representing us, that are taking the mantle, that are speaking out as the Pacific warriors, or as people who are challenged by systemic racist policies in our schools, in our institutions, with the forces of climate change, with the pressures of COVID-19, with the race riots in the United States. This is all part of our story as well, because for many of us, we experience it. We are the ones that are crossing the roads and then we get picked up by the police for doing nothing. That we have our names mispronounced incorrectly. That people think that we come from one place, but we don't. So I'll leave you with this slide and with the rest of Educ 101 if you want to know more. Of course, I have my stage 2 class, excuse me, in trimester 2 of each year, Pacific Nations Education. We unpack, get into this in a lot more detail. But it is time to wake ourselves up around Pacific peoples and education. For so long, we've experienced abrasive conditions in education and health and society, And it is time to go back to appreciating the strengths, the skills, and the knowledge systems and our identities in ways that will challenge the world, that would challenge policymakers, that would challenge the government, and that we will not just be a box to tick. Kia kaha. All the best for the rest of the course. Take care.